I'm speaking today with a veteran of CCSB and CCSA, Celia Wall, retired professor in journalism and mass communications at Murray State University. It's a pleasure to talk with you today, and I'm looking forward to sharing your memories, or you sharing your memories of your various trips and responsibilities for CCSB and A over the years. So could we begin maybe by you describing how it was you first got involved, whether you'd done study abroad as a student yourself before, or whether this was a new idea to you when you first made contact with us?
Okay, I tried to do study abroad when I was a graduate student at Murray State, but it was with Keys. And I was on a sabbatical from my job at Memphis State, working on my master's in journalism. And I wanted to do study abroad. I had always wanted to travel overseas. I have no idea why, where that came from, but it was there. And I did sign up for a program, and I think it was Germany. But because I was on leave from Memphis State, I unexpectedly had to return early, so I had to pull out of the program. And after that, I kept wanting to go. I couldn't afford to go overseas, truthfully. So I traveled around for a couple of jobs, ended up back at Murray State in 1980, and I was in the library. My first career stage was as a librarian. So I was in the reference department and then head of circulation. And this lasted for about 7 years. And by that point, I was so burned out, it was awful. Then a friend of mine who was from England came by one day. He knew that I was burned out. And Tracy Harrington had approached him about taking a job part-time as study abroad coordinator. He was not interested, could not get away from his department half-time. So he said, well, why don't you check it out? So I did. I had made an interview with Tracy the next day. And following the interview, I decided that basically study abroad coordinator was a public relations job, which I had done much of my career. I was a PR person. So Tracy seemed to like me. And so we agreed that we would do it on a one-year basis. I was study abroad coordinator the next year. I was smart enough to realize that Tracy was using my talents beyond study abroad coordinator. So I went to the provost and said, I would like to be acting assistant director. They agreed to it. So I sort of jumped up. The following year, Tracy decided to take a leave of absence and ended up doing that for 3 years. So I was put into the slot of acting director of the Center for International Programs. And it was at that point that I got more involved with programs, of course. So it was CCSB at that time. And my problem is that it's the sequencing that I'm having some difficulty with. I decided eventually that I did not want the job as international programs director, but I had been involved with CCSA and CCSB, working with faculty who were going overseas, working with students who were going overseas. But I decided at that point to go back to school and get my doctorate. So after 2 years, came back and was put into the journalism department. Within a matter of 6 months, Gary Hunt, who had been on the board with Ron Sella, decided to leave Murray State. And Ron, thank the Lord, I have actually written him a nice letter last year thanking him for doing this, got me assigned to replace Gary Hunt on the board. So that would have been, again, I can't, the dates. But when I initially went on the, are you able to cut some of these blah, blah, blahs out?
Oh, sure. Don't worry.
When I went on the program CCSA, London Winter Program, I think it was the first London Winter Program. There were 28 people, and Mike Clembar was the director. And truthfully, many of those 28 people were not students. they were going for the theater. So during that program, since it was such a small program, got to know Mike. More importantly, perhaps, I got to watch how he directed a program, which years later proved to be invaluable. He was organized, he was professional, he was, once he said we were going to do X, we did X. So he had a good handle on the program. He did a great job. So when we got back, obviously he liked me for some reason and called and asked if I would be willing to work as an assistant director on the London Summer that year, which really surprised me because I thought that it was only board members that were doing the directing. Anyway, I went. I thought as an assistant director, when I went to the orientation session, some reason the director had stepped down, and all of a sudden I was directing a program that I knew nothing about. And anyway, so it was a very interesting program that year. But then I don't know how much detail you want. Like I say, it was a very interesting program. Some of the board members that you asked me about, I think Baker was with us, Burkhart was there, Ron Sella was there that summer. So it was a good group of people who supported me. We did have, within about 48 hours, 72 hours, we called the police twice. It was just one issue after another. One kid thought it was good to take an envelope, put all of his money in there, write on it how much money it was, and leave it on his textbook in the cafeteria, which of course was not there when he got back. Then the first night, two of our students who had decided to stay out late, which of course we didn't advise, come in late, see a sleepless person sleeping in the hallway, and rather than going to get a guard, they woke him up, and he then proceeded to chase them through the dorm. The next morning, we had all of that floor who was ready to go home. And this was capped off with Sunday night when I'm in my pajamas and my robe. There's a knock on the door. Mike's standing there in his pajamas and robe, and he's had a student who was down in the bar area and was threatening suicide, he thought. So when I got back after that summer,
you survived that summer.
I survived that summer barely. When I got back,
just a quick question: did you see anything of London during that summer, or were you just totally tied up?
Actually, that's a story into itself. Bill Palmer. No, I'm sorry, that's my neighbor. He was at Kentucky State.
Bill Pollard.
Thank you, Bill Pollard. Took me. The faculty got together and told him he was supposed to take me out one afternoon. So we went on a very interesting trip with Bill, who, as many times he'd been to London, actually didn't know where he was. And he read a map upside down. So that was not good. But Mike called me after the trip to sort of debrief. And I said, he asked me, he said, would you be willing to do this again? I said, no, not until the memory of this summer is completely erased, which I loved London, though, what little I saw of it. So I did go back repeatedly after that.
As an administrator or as a teacher?
As an administrator. I only taught in that 20-something twice as a teacher. The first time was a London winter program, and then a couple of years later as a London summer, on a London summer program. After the first time, I called Mike and I said, boy, have you made a mistake? And he said, what? I said, you let me teach. I said, this is a different ball game from being an administrator, So, but I did go back a couple times after that, I think. But we had some great teams working. I was in London for 2005, the two terrorist attacks. Mike had very wisely decided that the administrative team needed to go into that program early. to get everything set up and ready. So we had been there 3 or 4 days when the first attack hit. I mean, that day we had students getting on planes. So we spent 5 or 6 hours in a little room that was our office trying to decide what to do. And, but again, because the faculty in the London summer tended to go do every 2 years, and the group of faculty that we were with that summer were seasoned faculty. They were fantastic. So it worked well. I often said that despite the terrorist attacks, that was one of the better programs we had. And I think part of that was the students were much more careful about where they went and what they did. And they weren't necessarily up till 3 in the morning and walking home by themselves. They were nervous enough, I guess, to behave themselves. So it was that was an interesting.
I was a faculty member on that program, and I remember. So I was, the day before we were flying that night, you guys were calling me and getting my assessment of the situation. What would happen if we cancel? What would happen if we let all the students fly in the next few hours? It was an incredibly tense moment, and it was wonderful being able to communicate with you guys. And then, as you say, I think London was a fascinating place to be in the midst of that. And I think there were fewer tourists, which made us and the faculty have an easier time getting around London with our students. But no, it's wonderful how we all came together at that moment. And it was a very moving experience, really.
And then when the second attack hit, of course, it was on a field trip day. So a large number of our faculty were not in London. They, you all were outside of the city. But it was amazing. You knew what to do. You called in and we said, stay in place until we know what's going on. And if you have to, I think maybe one group actually had to stay out of town overnight because London was kind of locked down at that point again. But I was sorry to say there was one point where London, at the hour, I guess, of the first bombing, went quiet. I don't know if you remember that, but everything shut down. And I hate to say, I was getting my hair done at that point. They were quiet. It was but it was an interesting summer. Probably it was one of those things where I said to myself, I always knew this would probably happen one day. I didn't want to be there when it happened. But we had Maggie and Ron and me were the 3 old timers. I think Jerry Hoare from Mississippi, Ole Miss was there maybe. But it was a really good group. And the people in the CCS office did a fantastic job. Yeah. Because they were dealing on the front line with the parents. And I think we only lost about 10 students who did not come.
I think so.
A couple of those were for totally different reasons. Yeah. So they had a memorable summer.
And remember, you participated in programs both in the old campus we used to go to in Kensington and then the one up in West Hampstead. Do you have any thoughts about what were the good and bad points of being in those 2 places?
Well, Kensington, of course, was great because it was right, a couple of blocks off Oxford Street. It was easy transportation in and out. So that was a wonderful location. Plus, you got to walk down the street and see the Bentleys and, all the money that was in that area. There were some great restaurants, but primarily it was the location. Plus, easy walking distance to Buckingham Palace. The kids like that. So I hated it when we had to leave. West Hampstead, though, it was a different atmosphere. It was more residential. West Hampstead was with an easy walking distance, and and then you had Hampstead, so it was 2 different classes of people, different types of people. You had the workers, and then you had Judi Dench, in Hampstead. Plus, I have to admit, I made some friends in Hampstead at King's College, Hampstead, who I still have. I still communicate with Susan James, who was the housing director. And so I went there enough that we sort of became one of the on-site staff. So, and they were fantastic. The first summer I went, believe it or not, in London in July, it was snowy. I had dressed for summer. I don't even think I even had a jacket. Susan was nice enough to loan me they called it a jumper, a sweater. And then as it turned out, there was actually a shopping mall not too far from there. So I went out and bought a couple things, but it was, we sort of bonded that summer over the weather.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that far to get to the, the bus stop down at the foot of the hill. So it took about 30 minutes to get into the central part of London, which was not bad. So.
Yes. And then you had experiences not just in Britain, but with other programs. Tell us about those.
The most interesting one was probably not most interesting, but the one that was farthest out of my comfort zone was Australia. And I went with Ray Aber. Normally, he would have been the director, but the previous year they had a bus wreck. And he had been injured. His wife had been, the wife anyway. And so he did not want to direct. So I did. That was a whole different experience because as soon as we got to we flew into Sydney and then on to Cairns. And once we got to Cairns, we immediately split up into 3 different groups. So I took a group of vet students who were going out to the ranches. And then the 3 girls, they were vet tech students. And they were so excited to be treated like real vet students. So they went out to different ranches. Their teacher stayed with me, and we stayed at the most unusual place I've ever stayed in. It had been one of the last Pony Express stations in Australia to shut down. And it was kind of a bed and breakfast place. And we literally stayed in the post office that had been split into multiple rooms. A couple of the girls stayed in a train car. They didn't like it. We thought it was great. And then we got to have dinner with the equestrian people from the region and from Sydney, who had come in to have dinner with us to talk about the horse market. And it was fantastic. Then when we got back to all get together, I was so glad that I had not been sent out with the one, that had gone to the ranch. I went to a sheep ranch. So these kids had gone out to a place where they had neutered the sheep. And I'm thinking, oh, thank goodness I didn't have to go on that one. So all I had to do was, shear sheep. So that was different. The airplane ride, though, is a killer to Australia. But it was 19 hours from LA. So, but I always said that if I was given the opportunity to go back again, I would have jumped in. It was like the United States back in the 50s at that time. Everything was cheap. The people were fantastic. So it was great. And where we stayed, Mike you always got good housing and tours. We did go out to the Great Barrier Reef. So that was fun. And it was fun watching people walk around with these little white bags that I discovered were for the Japanese tourists who got seasick. So they go running. Yeah.
Oh dear.
Yeah. So then the other program, I did the first program to Ireland and Scotland, London and Ireland. Winter program with David Balthroop and his theater group. And that was kind of neat because, again, we spent a week in London and then we spent a week in Dublin, which was interesting because I ended up wearing the same outfit every day for 7 days in Dublin because it was so blasted cold.
Oh dear.
So, same turtleneck, corduroy.
People
But
get used to you on trips like that. They don't care that much about your elegant costume as long as you keep warm.
no, no, no.
And was that your first time to Ireland?
It may have been. Huh. Yeah, I think it was. I didn't realize that. Yeah.
So
And then
once again,
David
once
Balfour
again,
was
you were
great.
sort of thrown into something, to administer in a country you hadn't actually visited before. That's just typical of how we did things in the early days, isn't it?
Yeah. And Australia was, like I say, Ray should have been the director. Um, the first time I was thrown in for a program as the director, a London winter, trying to think. Oh, Jack White from Mississippi
Yeah.
was with me as an assistant director, and I loved being an assistant director. I didn't get to sleep. I didn't eat. I just was stressed the whole time. It's just me. I wanted things to be well done, well planned, organized, and sometimes they just don't work that way. But now, one of our more interesting programs was a London winter when I was the director. That may have been the same one. Guess who one of my participants was? Mike.
Mike Klambara?
Yeah.
He went around for the ride, did he?
Mike and Linda went, and Robin Byerly called me and she said, Celia, I think you should know that Mike and Linda are going to be two of your participants. And I said, okay, because knowing Mike by that point, I knew him for several years, and I'm thinking, okay, can he really do this and let me direct? So I thought about it 24 hours and I called her back and I said, I need to give you a message to Mike. I said, will you explain to Mike that I will be the director so long as he doesn't try to take over. And if he does try to take over or to move in, then I will fly home the next day. Yeah, she broke down and I said, Robin, I'm not kidding. And he will know I'm not kidding. And he did very well. There was only once, and it just nearly killed him to just sit there. But it turned out, well, that was when Linda got food poisoning. So he was occupied for some little place they had lunch, and she was in the hospital by that night. So it was,
boy.
Yeah. But see, that's Roger, my partner, always kidded me about these boondoggles I was going on. And finally, one time in London summer, I was at the hospital. I had been at the hospital for hours. We had a student who had gotten food poisoning really bad. And she was refusing to stay in the hospital. Yeah. Now she was like 30 years old. So anyway, so I went outside and I dialed Roger's number because I had been there overnight. I was having trouble with this student getting her to make sense. And I'm sorry to say he was lucky he was not home. So it's like, these are not boondoggles. We earn our money here. So
did you ever get him to come with you so he could see what work you were doing?
I actually did. But trying to think, when he came with me the first time, I was teaching. So obviously it wasn't the same experience until we had a student who didn't come home that night. And at 5 a.m, I was the on-call faculty, and we had to deal with the police at that point. So, yeah.
Amazing.
Oh, well.
So that's wonderful that you had those 3 different kinds of experiences, from Australia, being out in the rural stretches of that country, to the congestion of London during the terrorism. It's a range of experiences there. But what would you say to somebody who questioned the value of doing study abroad, both from students' viewpoint and from faculty viewpoint? What did you see as the most important contribution you were making and that students gained from being participants?
Well, I don't mean to digress, but I need to give a little history. I was born in Marshall County, Kentucky. It's a small town north of where I live now in Callaway County. And it's a rural community. It's traditional. One of the reasons that I was so adamant about study abroad for the students was that I grew up in Marshall County. I had not been much outside of the region until, after I graduated from college. It frustrated me. It still does when I had a student who was excellent in they could compete with anybody anywhere. As far as I taught public relations, they could have gone to Chicago, they could have gone to New York, London. They were that good. And then they wouldn't go anywhere outside of Western Kentucky. And I found that so frustrating because I said, it's fine if you don't like it out there. You don't want to live in Chicago or Nashville or wherever, but you should know that it exists and what there is there. And so I worked very hard on recruiting my students, our students in general, to study overseas. We had competition with Keys. And one of the things they said was, well, going to an English-speaking country is not really the experience you want. Excuse me, I was trying to clean up my language here. Like hell, it's not. Because many of these students have never been to Nashville, Memphis, Paducah for that matter. I just wanted them to get outside their comfort zone and if they come back, that's fine. One student that I sent was on a Keys program, a young woman who had graduated from high school, didn't go to college, but went to beauty school, finally came back and took a class from Charlotte Ban in the history department, Chinese. She fell in love with the Asian culture. So we worked up a thing. We did an exchange for her not an exchange, but a placement in Korea. She was nervous about it, but she went. Plus, at that point, they were having some student riots on the campus where she was going. But she decided, I think she sold her beauty shop at that point and said, okay, I'm going to do this. The young woman who came back and sat in my office to tell me what it was like was not the one who went. This person was a different person. She was more self-confident. She went on to finish her degree. She married a young man from Korea, as it turned out. So it's a life-changing experience for students. Faculty, I think I've always, when I was recruiting faculty, I said, first of all, do you like students? Not all faculty like students. I said, because you have to like students to go on these programs. Because you're not doing it for the money. You're not doing it, to have tons of time out on your own, particularly on the shorter term programs. And I said, if you like students and you want to see them grow, then this is one way to do it. And faculty who were teaching overseas were our best recruiters. So I think in both cases, it was just amazing experience. When I was acting director, occasionally people from different departments would bring their people they were interviewing for jobs into my office. And I kept saying, folks, this is one of the best things we've got on this campus, because this is an opportunity that you have if you want to teach and work overseas. And it was amazing because, CCSA is a great program.
And it made a difference for some faculty. It made Murray a more attractive place to come, knowing that they had that option.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. One other aspect of your experience with CCSA was serving on the board. those could be marathon sessions, couldn't they?
They could be.
I remember so well your comment about one person we won't name, when you said after a particularly long meeting in which this person had gone on an incredible length about almost every point that was brought up. You said about this professor, they never had an unexpressed thought. And I thought that was exactly right. Something come to your head, say
Oh
it.
yeah.
No,
Yeah, I
it.
knew when your first sentence where you were going with that. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I spent a summer a program there and ended up spending a good time with this person because being single, I sort of hooked on to whoever didn't have spouses and girlfriends and things with them. The same thing happened there.
Yes.
Yeah. But the board members, I retired, I guess it was 11 years ago, 12 this year. And one of the hardest things about that decision, I was ready to retire. I retired 4 years early. And one of the hardest things was giving up a community of friends, part of the CCSA board, because going to that was like homecoming twice a year. You know, you go and, oh my goodness, great, Jeff, how you doing? What's going on? You know, and I miss that still. I've talked, well, I won't go there, but one memory that came to me when I was reading through your notes was there was a year that we had a board meeting at Northern Kentucky, and something about something that we had passed or did the previous board meeting, the director didn't quite agree with us. So when we showed up, we were in a Quonset hut. I don't know if you remember that, but we were in a Quonset hut with metal tables, plastic seats, and the meal was brought in. And what was supposed to be hot was cold, and what was supposed to be cold was hot. So, and this young woman sitting next to me had, I don't remember where she was from, but she was kind of a substitute for our regular board member. And she leaned over to me and she said, John, whatever his name was, said, these meals and were really nice and the housing was great. And I'm going, it usually is. The director's mad at us also. But the board meetings were fun.
Yes. It's funny because Ron Sella's version of that story is that some board members had complained that CCSA was spending too much money on board meetings. It was an extravagance that we couldn't afford. And so Mike decided, well, I'll cut back then and see how they like that. They didn't like it at all. Oh dear.
Well, but like I say, it was a good group of people. And I remember this was a couple years before I retired. I had gotten the alumni outstanding teacher that year. And there was a standing ovation when I walked in. People were clapping, congratulations. And it's like, these people are more excited about this than my family was. So it's I miss that. That was good. That was good. So.
Well, it's fascinating to think of how you nurtured that thought as a girl growing up, that you wanted to expand your horizons beyond Marshall County. And then you've done so much in your life, your professional life, to do exactly that for so many students. You must feel very good about how you opened up the world for countless numbers of students when you served in those various capacities. That's a great legacy.
I do. And then we were very lucky that Murray State had other not study abroad program. Well, they did. They had keys, but we had other opportunities for faculty development programs. So I also got to go to Regensburg, Germany 3 or 4 times. I went to China one year. Talk about stepping outside my comfort zone. So they were supportive in that respect. But one of your questions, I can't remember what it was, but faculty on these programs, it wasn't just Murray State, it was other schools. Actually, sometimes they did this because they loved it, because they wanted students to have this opportunity, not because they were going to be rewarded at their home institution. Because in many cases, I know we had faculty at other campuses who were just told, just leave it off there. Don't put that on there. I lucked out that I just ignored that. I decided that what I was I knew where my goal was. And I also knew I gave up summer work because I didn't want to teach in the summer. I wanted to travel, and it was a wonderful opportunity. And I know CCSA has suffered the last 2-3 years now. So I really hope that things go well, because it's a lot to lose. Students are more comfortable going to a country that they know the language, or at least with England, they think they know the language.
Yes. And in Scotland, there's nothing similar at all.
Forget that.
Oh, dear.
I was once on where was I? I had been in Scotland, and I had gotten on the train at Newcastle, somewhere up in there, in Newcastle in England. But I had gotten on the train, and I was making a change, and I had a big suitcase. God knows why but I'm changing trains. This man gets off the train, helps me off the train, and then I'm sitting between the man and his wife. I swear, for 2 hours, I didn't understand a word that was said to me. It was Glaswegian.
Oh,
And
my, yeah.
I do hope I'm not agreeing to white slavery or something. Yeah, but that was, yeah. And there was a tour in Scotland, and just shut me up whenever you need to. There was we went to Scotland, to Edinburgh, and then we went out for a trip. And we had stopped one place, and the bus driver was standing there, and one of the students said, "Where are we going next?" I was young at this directing, so I didn't have my itinerary on me. And so I went to the bus driver, and I said, "Where are we going next?" And he answered, and I said, "Could you say that one more time?" He did. I said, "Could you slow it down a little?" He did. I walked back to the students, and I said, "I have no idea where the hell we're going." Couldn't understand. But those are the things that you remember and that you value, and that they're memories that these kids are building. I can't tell you how many students I've had that I've seen after they graduated. And one was the bank manager, and he told me one day, he said, "I really made a mistake by not listening to you, because I'm now a full-time job. I have a wife and 2 children. I can't, we're hoping someday to be able to go to London for a week." And I said, "Tried, worked on it, Mike." So anyway, but hopefully things continue and things get back to normal.
Right. We're all hoping that.
Yeah.
Well, it's been wonderful chatting with you about these golden years with CCSA. I really appreciate you taking the time to share some of those memories.